I think Shadow of the Colossus is as good a place to start as any. To say it's an experience that rewards interpretation is a bit of an understatement. Engaging with its world and story shows a stunning dynamic of extremes, really. 16 intense and dramatic battles are punctuated with 15 moments of quietly experiencing the Forbidden Land. Likewise, the narrative drenches the first minutes and the climactic ending, but outside of that it is staggeringly sparse. I believe that part of the reason Shadow of the Colossus has endured as long as it has is thanks to this. When an audience has a wonderfully crafted atmosphere and feeling, but only sparse amounts of information, it breathes a certain reality of life into that world. Much like in real life, we often lack and will perhaps never have all the information we need to constantly assess all risks and rewards. So when it comes to key decisions, we, much like Wander the protagonist, must kind of make our own truth by simply following our gut and hoping our goals are as reached by the conclusion of the efforts we make in life. Now naturally, with the same ambiguity comes an almost need for interpretation. Take for example Wander and Mono's relation. While it is simple enough for us to read in a love story, no concrete elements really exist to suggest this with 100% certainty. Do they even know each other in life? And why does Wander have such an extreme bond in pursuing his task? I think the mythological-like nature of Shadow of the Colossus never wanted a solid weaving of an explanation into the world. The mysteries that are unanswered stay with us the longest, and likewise the experience we feel the deepest but never have a full understanding of affect us the most. By eliminating this vital information, our minds can never become a passive driver of the world. We are denying the causal links that allow us to quietly connect and bury the story to the conclusion of complete and logical understanding. So, with all that in mind, I suppose I would like to offer my rough interpretation and understanding of the events now that I've had the chance to experience it again after a long while. The nature of Dorman is one of the most intriguing aspects, I think. The nature of Dorman reminded me a great deal of a documentary I watched some years ago. Into Eternity is about the issue of storing nuclear reactor waste, underground in massive vaults, for potentially a very long time. However, with this, there came the concept of how to properly communicate that this specific substance should not be dealt with, and should be stayed away from. What architecture do you see? What kind of symbols can you use? How do you convince someone on the other end of even just 1,000 years not to disturb or change what is best left alone? This very much led me to a direction of thinking about Shadow of the Colossus more and more through this interpretation of technology. There seems to be a very Japanese understanding of how technology can be morally implicated, whereas in Western culture there's kind of hypocritical disdain for technology. From a Japanese perspective, at least within the portrayal of certain works, is dividing technology into two broad categories. A perfect example that comes to mind is the Flying Castle of Laputa from Hayao Miyazaki's film with the same name. Everything about the castle's design and architecture perfectly communicates these two ideas. On top of the castle is a beautiful verdant forest garden, filled with massive trees, beautifully decorated interiors. Meanwhile, the bottom of the castle is an immense black, destructive fortress, capable of wielding nuclear fire. The robots of the castle, much like its crystal heart, show how the schemes of technology can be used both in balance and out of balance. The humanoid machines can simultaneously be gentle, caring gardeners, taking care of things until they quite literally break down, or they can be harbingers of destruction. This distinction is further expressed in another of Miyazaki's works, the wonderful Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, specifically the manga. Set after a great calamity destroys the super-advanced human civilization, Miyazaki makes note of using two repositories of human knowledge in the world, long after this has occurred. On the one end, the Crypt of Shua is a sleek, black, monolithic structure. Within resides all the dark technology of the world before. The biological engineering of disease, weapons, and organisms, the engineering of vast, destructive, powerful energies, a kind of clinical immortality. In contrast, there also exists the Oasis. Its characteristic architecture is almost the complete opposite. Instead of black fortifications, we instead find sprawling fields, gardens overgrowing natural structures, a library, and, perhaps most notably, a windmill. Here, all the light technology expresses what is basically preserved: art, poetry, literature, and music. As well, the biological preservation of hundreds of extinct species of animals and plants, wiped out during the 7 days of fire that destroyed the previous world. This differentiation of technology into a kind of light side and dark side of ideas born from respecting and working together with the natural cycles of the world, and of unnatural technologies born from the pursuit of gaining more and more energy and power. This concept was eventually what led me to kind of understand Shadow of the Colossus. Of course, some will say that all of the portrayed light and dark elements are simply magic, and not really technology. But for that, I kind of have to cite the classic, any sufficiently advanced technology is basically indistinguishable from magic. We can now return to Dorman. Although it has many signifiers from mythology, horns, the black smoky shape, the name of the mythical king, so on and so forth, I think that Dorman makes sense in this kind of metaphorical lens. Here Dorman is more like uranium, a force not really natural to how nature functions, but brought out by humankind. Much like nuclear energy, Dorman's forces can provide an immense tide of power, able to do kind of miraculous things like reverse death, and, as well, give life to the Colossi. Here, the Forbidden Lands and the Colossi become a kind of nuclear waste disposal area, or contamination zone. Of course, the Colossi are a vast step up from simply burying nuclear waste. Instead, they can defend themselves and lie dormant for however long is needed. Even better, they are directly animated by Dorman's strength, and return to earth and rock when the tendrils of his power leaves. Like a prison for waste powered by radioactive decay itself. So, much like the radiation in nuclear energy, I would not characterize Dorman as evil per se in the moral sense, any more than radiation or nuclear fission is evil. I instead would say that Dorman is a being of pure out-of-balance technology or power, energy not very much derived from the natural cycles of the world. Of course, the Colossi are not just made of dark, but also light. Wander's sword is based clearly on the light technology, and in piercing the membrane of that, the remains of Dorman can be released, and coalesces once all 16 Colossi are dead. This way Dorman can reach a kind of critical mass once again. I think the gentle nature of many of the Colossi shows through from this more light technology-derived balance of functions. The horse-like nature, or the kind of avian-like nature. So now I think I could kind of begin to build something of a story for the Forbidden Land. Judging by the plethora of structure-like technology, the Colossi themselves, it's clear that the original inhabitants were quite proficient with it. Perhaps this is what was meant by began from the resonance of intersecting points, as Emon points out in the introduction. This would imply that many of the natural cycles were already in an amplified resonance within this location. So having mastered these technology, Dorman appears. I think that Dorman, in its representation of this kind of out-of-balance technology, also represents the inherent power within that. It'll always be so much more superior than light technology because of the same natural cycles which keep light technology in balance can be disregarded and disobeyed. Of course, the costs are much higher, and the consequences are far worse. How Dorman originally came to be is another question entirely. I think it's safe to say that one way or another, it coalesced, and in doing so, the original inhabitants of the Forbidden Land perceived it as a threat. Perhaps they, being experts in light technology, only naturally could tell Dorman was a very serious issue. Perhaps a more likely darker explanation exists. Perhaps they, after having reached the limits of what could be done, beholden to the balances of how nature should properly work, instead sought out Dorman and summoned it as a means of growing stronger and defying the limits of what remained. Like the Queen in Eco, they sought to wield immortality, or perhaps, judging by the capabilities of the Colossi, the raw destructive potential of Dorman. At some point, either way a turning occurred. The Shrine of Worship, a rather ominously named place for something that contains Dorman, was converted. Now instead of its original purpose, it would, along with the rest of the Forbidden Land, be a disposal and exclusion zone. Like how Chernobyl was sealed and the area was cordoned off, now the original home of those inhabitants would be the same. This speaks either to how vast and dangerous the task was, or perhaps how desperately convinced they were of the need for such. I think this interpretation as well explains Emon and Wander's people. I think, logically enough, they're the descendants of those who originally inhabited that land. They're clearly not very advanced, or at least not in the manner that thousands of years of time would expect to bring. Instead, they have a very mythologized version of the sealing of Dorman. Their cloaks and crossbows obviously show a much more rudimentary form of technology. Those same cloaks bear the seal of light which shows up in the Colossus, showing that at the very least they preserved the tradition of how to contain Dorman and control it, even if it's become a very more mythological and magical version of those events. Still, the preservation and the fact that there's a backup seal in the pool of water, something that they clearly know, and I found very eerily reminiscent of the emergency cooling procedures for reactors. They clearly passed on this vital information one way or another. Of course, as a final thing, something always seems strange. If the task of sealing Dorman was so utterly urgent, why did they leave the bridge behind, so that someone like Wander could come along and basically do the events that occurred? I think the answer is a kind of melancholic and tragic one. I think that perhaps, given long enough, hoping that Dorman's powers would fade, or perhaps at the very least become dissipated, much like radioactivity, they would one day be able to return home. Perhaps after the influence of Dorman was finally gone.